Section 230. This is an issue that we've addressed in the past, and there have been some recent developments on the issue. Now, this is the section of the law that governs when websites can be liable for the content they publish on their websites. And so there was an executive order by the president, by President Trump. And what's the latest wrinkle in the story, Eric?
So we did cover this in last week's episode. So I did want to do this sort of brief follow up. This is a Washington Examiner article, and it says Trump's unexpected allies in the fight against Twitter and censorship, Facebook and the FCC. Now, we did cover that before. The executive order that Trump did regarding Section 230 obviously applied directly to the FCC. So that's no surprise to anyone, I don't think, who's followed this story in any regard. But what's interesting is this article talks about Zuckerberg's position in this whole situation is quite different than Twitter's position. And that basically, I don't know if I have the exact quote here. I wish I had a way to tab this. But basically, here it is. Zuckerberg said Facebook does not want to be, quote, an arbiter of truth. And I personally really like this. And the article mentions that, of course, Zuckerberg, being the head of Facebook and Twitter being a rival, it does make some business sense that Zuckerberg would want to have a position opposite of Twitter, where Twitter, of course, is adding these quote unquote fact-checking labels to certain politicians, including the president, while they're not doing it with others. Zuckerberg is saying, well, Facebook doesn't want to be involved in that game. They don't want to be an arbiter of truth. They want people to decide for themselves. And in this article, Zuckerberg is even quoted as saying, I don't agree with the president. I don't like a lot of what he says, but that doesn't mean I'm going to censor him. So I thought this is pretty interesting because on the one hand, you can be very cynical and say that Zuckerberg is only taking this position because Twitter is a rival and Twitter is a competitor. But I like this quote, because I don't want social media platforms to be arbiters of truth. What do you think of that, Pete?
Well, what I would say is I am a little skeptical. Whenever you have these major regulations, they're going to affect different platforms differently. So I do think right now Zuckerberg anticipates that the repeal or the closing the enforcement, I should say, expanding the enforcement and narrowing the scope of Section 230 would affect Twitter more than it would affect Facebook. That Twitter has, well, I don't know if you saw the Joe Rogan episode where Jack Dorsey and his head censor talked to Tim Pool and Joe Rogan and tried to defend the decisions they've made editorially of who they kick off the platform, who they allow to speak, who they censor, who they don't. And it was very clear that there was a left-leaning bias. Just even in the rules themselves, there was a left-leaning bias. Now, I think Facebook is less transparent about that, and they've come under less scrutiny. They've been attacked for fact checking and stuff like that. This is the first time that Twitter has done fact checking, and clearly the executive order was aimed at Twitter. Facebook has been doing fact checking for a while. It hasn't been nearly as controversial. We haven't seen the president responding this way. So I would imagine that Zuckerberg, for whatever reason, he believes that these regulations are not going to apply to Facebook, or at least it's not going to impact him as much. So I think he's expecting some kind of a benefit from all of this.
Well, the article does mention that Facebook actually does profit from ads by Donald Trump more so than Twitter does. So I'm not trying to say that there's no financial motive and there's no cynicism, but I do agree with the sentiment because I would like to see social media platforms be as neutral as possible, because that's what the word platform means to me. Platform means that it's a venue for you to discuss, just like a stage or a podium, the town square, or whatever it is. And we have to realize that for many people, these social media platforms are the equivalent of the public square.
Mhm.
They really are in the modern
Yeah,
age, especially when you think about the recent pandemic we had.
right. Yeah, and a lot of the information about that, a lot of things that people were posting about COVID-19 especially, were being heavily censored. They were saying this isn't true, this is dangerous, or this is misleading. Well, what's misleading? Is it misleading if um, that it brings somebody to a different opinion than the censor has? Because that's just leading. It could just be leading. If that's the right opinion, and who's to say that the censor is right? Now, again, it's their platform. I think it's a free country. They're allowed to do what they're going to do, but at the same time, there has been a question: are these monopolies? Is this a public trust? And if these are a public trust, should they be treated as a public trust? Should we break them up? Should we subject them to further regulation, just like we've done to the phone companies? Where at one time the phones were heavily regulated, and then they were ultimately broken up because it was a monopoly. And you can't let one company have a stranglehold on the information that reaches the American people. And so, uh, whether whatever the wisdom is of these moves, I think Twitter and Facebook are in dangerous territory. Um, I would just bring up one other thing. You know, After the 2008 crisis, the Democrats were seemed to be pretty unanimous that repealing Glass Steagall was a big mistake. That the separation of commercial and investment banking was a big mistake, and they were saying, "See, that's a special favor for companies that we got rid of that regulation." But the reason that regulation was actually put in place was to mess over JP Morgan. JP Morgan was the only, what now JP Morgan Chase was the only major bank not to back FDR in the election. He backed Herbert Hoover instead. All of the and that was the only bank to combine commercial and investment banking. And so, a lot of these goody two shoes regulations that are meant to that appear on the surface to protect the public are actually written to protect powerful interests. And so, I have to believe. Maybe I'm too much of a cynic. I have to believe that Zuckerberg is lobbying behind the scenes to regulate Twitter out of the way so that he can gain more market share.
That's interesting because I have to say, I mean, if you look at the numbers, Facebook blows Twitter away. I mean, they're barely a significant competitor. I mean, it's
Oh
almost
yeah.
like it's almost like some people talk about that they they just keep Target around so that Walmart doesn't become a monopoly. I've heard that before. Because when you look, it's kind of like Coke and Pepsi. There's a good analogy. Coke just blows Pepsi away. I mean, just absolutely has blown them away for decades and decades and decades. But Pepsi still is still around. You know what I mean? And a lot of people, that they get sort of almost conspiratorial about it. Is the only reason they're still around is so Coca-Cola doesn't have to be declared a monopoly. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
that's why you keep competitors like that around.